Right, Larry, thank you for being here. You're just the kind of friend I need at a
Well,
time
I
like
don't
this.
know. Yeah, and you're the friend I need because I've been getting it from all sides too. So it's great to chat with you. Thanks for inviting me.
People have been very cross, haven't they? There's a lot of elevated feeling around at the moment.
Well, I subscribe it to Pope Francis PTSD.
Yeah, that's it.
Uh,
Yes, that's
we've been,
right.
we've been so accustomed to a pope that clearly doesn't like the theological position from which we arise, and made it very clear that he didn't care for us that much, that we're spoiling for a fight. And I'm trying desperately not to let that affect my opinion of Pope Leo, whose pontificate is still so fresh, so new,
Yeah.
that I don't want to read into his pontificate the scars of the previous one.
Well, I feel exactly the same way. I know I've been in a, you know, in years of turbulence, and I think it's quite right not to underestimate the emotional damage that the uncertainty has caused. One can cope with a certain amount of uh, 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 different opinions, but it was the uncertainty, never quite knowing whether the ground under your feet was going to be taken away. And people have been quite critical of the fact that how dare I come into the Catholic Church. It did take me 40 years of thinking I'm praying my way in it. I didn't rush in. But when I came in, I found Francis. And I remember saying to my bishop, who asked me to convert, that I said, look, I'm not sure I can cope with the Pope. I may need your help. Uh, I won't report what
Yeah.
he said. I'll only. But the fact is, it was a very painful and difficult time. And whatever the state of his soul, and it's not for us to say, only to ask for mercy for ourselves. Um,
Yeah.
it has been difficult, and it's not surprising that people are I was going to say overreacting, but reacting intensely to what is a period of uncertainty, because Pope Leo is just about to explain himself to us, and that's what I think this exhortation does.
Yeah, I before we get into that, I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish, even though I'm not a convert. I'm a cradle Catholic. I so enjoy the liturgy. I so enjoy the company of them. But the bottom line is that I am a cradle Catholic in the midst of an ocean of converts, uh, mostly converts from Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, and so
Mm.
in my conversations, I've coined a new acronym, PASS, which is Post Anglican Stress Syndrome.
Yeah, it's very good.
you
I know it
know,
already. I know what that is. Yes.
yes, and so the memory of living within the Anglican communion and
Oh,
watching it slowly descend into utter apostate madness is a difficult thing for for many of my friends to negotiate. The turbulent landscape that they now find in the Catholic Church. So I'm hoping that Pope Leo, and we'll get into his document now, I hope Pope Leo is a force for peace and calmness and sanity. And I don't expect that Pope Leo is going to be uh, like John Paul II or like Benedict. He's his
no,
own
indeed.
man.
No, that's
But
that's different.
I
Yeah.
hold out hope that he's also not going to be like Pope Francis. And so I think that so far we see no indication of what direction he really wants to go. He's kind of right now a blank slate still. And I just had an article come out this morning or last night in Catholic World Report, which is my commentary on the Pope's new apostolic exhortation, Delixit, I have loved you. And the point that I make is that despite a few points of quibble here and there, it's actually a rather unremarkable document. I say at the end, I breathe a sigh of relief that what is most noteworthy about this new document is that it doesn't raise my blood pressure, essentially, and
That's
that's a
that's
go ahead.
Well, no, that's so interesting because it does it. I prefer your view to mine. I look forward to your convincing me. It raises mine at the end when I think I'm being drawn back into South American liberation theology. But there are
Yeah.
other bits of it which I love and I'm extremely grateful for. So I'm really happy. I'm here for some therapy and to be convinced. But can I just go back because I don't get much chance to talk about it. For those of us who are Anglicans or Episcopalians, we saw a strategy of disruption, decay, disorder, anarchy, anti-Holy Spirit for the last 50 or 60 years. And it had a character, it had a theological character, a spiritual character, a psychological character, a political character, and it was absolutely, and then pick your own rude adjective, disastrous. So for many of us, what you've described, I just want to amplify it a bit because you
Sure.
described it so beautifully. To have seen that take place, and then it's not an easy thing to convert. You lose everything. But you find more than you lost. However, in this fairly traumatic transition and exchange, to suddenly discover that this spirit has followed you in, and it's it got there before you, and it's trying to undermine the people who have authority in just the same way that it got to the ones you've left behind. That leads to a certain degree of existential panic, and it's that panic that we've come out of with the death of Francis. And therefore, and I want to say to the people who said to me, look, Ashenden, you're naive and you're optimistic and you're really not thinking straight. I said, well, those things may or may not be true, but I have to tell you, it's been emotionally traumatic, and I'm looking forward to settling down.
Yeah, and well, even us cradle Catholic, even we cradle Catholics, we a lot of us have the same feelings, even though we're not converts. We have similar feel. I mean, my first year in the seminary was the first year of Pope John Paul's pontificate. Wow. And he remains for me, the great ecclesiastical hero of my life. And yes. So I always looked, because as a Catholic in that era, post-Vatican II, you were surrounded by madness, is what George Weigel called the silly season of the church. And into that madness rode on a white horse in shining armor our great savior, Pope John Paul II, and then followed by the great, amazing Pope Benedict. So there was this feeling, well, at the very least, the center holds. At the very least, we have Rome. At the very least, the promises to Peter are coming true, and we can always hang our hat on Rome. Well, the problem with Pope Francis, I differ from some of his strongest critics who say he was a heretic or whatever, although he had his moments. We could talk about that, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole.
No.
The fact is, he was all of a sudden, even cradle Catholics like myself would look to Rome. We're going, what the heck's going on? I remember in the first 2 or 3 years of the Francis pontificate, I was still so imbued with this belief in Rome's perdurance as this steadfast thing. I was a staunch defender of Pope Francis for maybe the first 2, 3, 4 years. And I can't pinpoint an exact moment where I was sort of red-pilled and the scales fell off my eyes. But there was eventually a time where I began to realize, no, this Pope is a train wreck. And he's taking the church down. As a friend of mine, a bishop, who I won't mention his name, but a friend of mine said, the problem with Leo isn't that he is, a heretic or whatever. The problem is he has re-empowered a wing of the church that we had hoped had been vanquished by John Paul and Benedict. So yes,
Leo, you said Leo? Do you mean Francis or do you mean Leo?
I meant Francis. I'm sorry. Thank you.
We'll come on to Leo, but exactly, that's exactly what
Francis was, that he had re-empowered that progressive wing of the church, which had always still been there underneath the waves of the John Paul and Benedict's pontificates, but nevertheless they did not have the upper hand. They were not valorized by Rome, and then you began to see episcopal appointments and so forth from Pope Francis that made it very, very clear. Holy cow! This is not a sort of creative, dynamic, evangelical pushing of the church in a new direction. It's taking us back to the era of 8-track tapes and lava lamps and hippies and, corded phones. And it's just like, it was, wait a minute, we've seen this. It doesn't work. And it was just so aggravating to see that. So my biggest beef on Francis was, I think he lacked, ironically, pastoral awareness. And I say ironically because his reputation was, he has such a pastoral soul. But I think he actually had no pastoral.
He was a cruel control freak. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not being rude. He was cruel. The way he went after the people who stood against him was cruel. And one of the reasons he was living in Santa Marta was because he wanted to keep control. He needed information. So neither, I mean, it doesn't matter. He's a control freak. That might be a right gift at a time of anarchy or disorder. And in terms of cruelty, we're all a bit cruel. I don't actually hold those against him as the most serious disorders. It was the anarchy. It was the internal anarchy,
Yes.
almost a delight in disruption that I found so upsetting. And well, I've welcomed Leo because I looked at him and I thought, I don't see you as an embodiment of. You certainly don't bring disruption. You look to me, if you've been an Augustinian running an order, like you're a calm, clear-thinking, clever man, and you keep on saying you want to be faithful to the teaching of the church. That gave me a huge amount of hope, maybe more than I should have had or he deserves. But that was the point where people were very cross with me and said, you need to open your eyes to what's coming. So let's discuss what you think has come in this apostolic exhortation.
Well, it's hard to tell. As I say in the beginning of my article, we have to remember that probably the great bulk of this exhortation was actually written by Pope Francis, and we don't know what parts maybe Leo got rid of and what parts he added, what parts maybe he modified. We can't tell that at all. Nevertheless, just as with Pope Francis publishing his first encyclical Lumen Fidei, which was largely written by Pope Benedict, that encyclical did not really serve as a kind of bellwether for where Francis was going to take the papacy. I viewed it more as him paying homage to his predecessor. It was a way of displaying continuity with his predecessor, respect for his predecessor. And I think Delixit is similar to that. It means something. I'm not saying it doesn't mean anything, but I don't see it as a programmatic statement of where Pope Leo wants to take the church. I think we have to remember that I think he's paying homage to Francis here by publishing this unfinished document.
Okay, let me ask you go on,
go
sorry,
ahead.
I beg your pardon. I want to ask you a theological question because I think there are bits of the document I love, which we'll talk about. I love the fact that we've gone through this journey through the fathers, through the mendicants. I like the history, the theology of spirituality, but I thought there's a theological flaw running right the way through, which I think Benedict fixes. So in my article, I say, look, why didn't you ask Benedict? Because he got it exactly right. But the flaw is this. It's the juxtaposition of Matthew and Luke in terms of the way they deal with poverty. So the Old Testament, the sense of impoverishment always seems to me to be one that is set in the framework of a relationship with God, not an economic relationship with your neighbor. In other words, the poor in spirit, the poor are those who hunger and thirst for more of God, and they have a sense of their poverty in relationship to His presence in their lives. And I think this is a Semitic or an Aramaic given that comes out of the experiment of creating a holy people, and that's what I think that the Hebrew sense of poverty in the first covenant means. And Matthew knows that. So when he reports Jesus saying, "Blessed are the poor," he assumes everyone knows what that means. Now Luke comes along and says, "Look, actually, we Greeks don't know what that means at all. We've come from an entirely different, literally an economy. Actually, so to all my readers, this Jewish man is talking about the poor in spirit. So let me translate it for you because you wouldn't know that otherwise." Now, I don't know what it is exactly in the 20th century that makes people want to behave economically. But it seemed to me that the whole misunderstanding of liberation theology and a desire for Marxist utopia kicked people back into an economic framework. And it's this economic framework that I find, particularly in the South American Council at the end. And I want to say at the very beginning of the document, wait, you're taking me on an entirely fallacious isn't the right word. You have not yet clarified your terms. Poverty is an immensely charged theological word, and you haven't defined it. And I suspect by not defining it, you may flip the switch and make this about economics and social justice if I'm not careful. And that's exactly what happens at the end. And I want, Benedict was on that. To be honest, I didn't know. I had to do some Google searching. I thought Benedict would have known about this. He would have written about it. And lo and behold, he did, and he got it perfectly right. And so my complaint is, if you have popes, John Paul II knew perfectly well that economics was not the currency of the church. He'd been in a Marxist economic society. He knew better than any of the others this was balderdash. Benedict knew perfectly well, because he was an intelligent, well-grounded theologian who was on top of things. What I don't understand is why Francis and Leo have kind of thrown themselves back into this. Well, we've got to fix the suffering of the South Americans and make them as rich as North Americans, and that's the kingdom of heaven. And that's the thing I feel haunted by in this document. Am I overreading it?
Perhaps, but
Okay.
but I'm going to read your comments charitably and say that you're not alone, that, it's one possible reading. He does mention the Arecibo meeting. He never mentions liberation theology specifically.
Okay,
but
that's right. He doesn't.
And so I think that's significant that he doesn't specifically mention liberation theology. He doesn't lionize any of its particular theologians by valorizing them, by mentioning their names and so forth. He does echo some of its themes, but the main theme that he echoes is the preferential option for the poor.
So, Larry, explain.
And as did John Paul.
This. Yeah, okay. But so what is this in Matthew? You explain it to me, please?
Well, I'll simply put, a preferential option for the poor means that we're following the commandment of our Lord, the Dominical commandment to in a sense pay attention to the poor, that they are almost our top priority in terms of our corporal and spiritual works of mercy, especially our corporal works of mercy. Christ could not have been clearer in his condemnations of wealth accumulation, of mammon, echoing the messages of prophets like Amos and Isaiah that, you can't claim to love God when you despise the least among you. There's the parable of Lazarus and so forth. Go ahead. No, right ahead.
I want to step into seminar mode here, and I hope this doesn't annoy our people. And I just, you're a professor, so you know the etiquette I'm bringing into this. Can I ask you to rebut this proposition for me? That as I've been thinking about this, this idea emerged that our Lord was much more worried about the rich than he was about the poor. Because, and indeed, you've just described the problem of the rich. The problem of the rich is they can't get into heaven because they're too rich. They're too well. They're too settled. And so Jesus in the gospel seems to me to be fixated on the rich. It's not so much a preferential option for the poor. It's a worrying about the rich, because the rich are just full of the wrong kind of stuff. And so when the widow throws this enormous sum of money for her into the temple treasury, he doesn't say to people, look, quickly make up her weekly income because this poor woman's going to be hungry now. He talks about the economy of the spirit, and says how rich she is in spirit, because we've mistaken the situation if we treat it economically. And so it seems to me almost, I don't know quite how to put this, but if you like, the poor and normative, the spiritual poverty somehow matches the economic poverty is in some way linked to spiritual poverty. There is an emptiness that needs filling. But actually, it's not so much a preferential, is it that? It's not a preferential treatment of the poor, but a very serious warning to the rich that whereas the poor can make it in because of they're not full of other stuff, the rich can't make it in because they are full. And so I read the Gospels in a different way. That Jesus is worried about my being rich. He's not worried about my neighbor not being able to pay his bills so much. My neighbor might be, and I should be worried. But tell me if I'm overreacting to.
No, I don't think. I think that's a good caveat. I think when we talk about a preferential option for the poor, we have to keep in mind, and Pope Leo does this in the exhortation, where he says there's different kinds of poverty. We're not just focused, Leo says, on economic poverty. There's all kinds of different forms of, and I think when we say preferential option for the poor in the life of Christ, I think it's very clear that he did prefer, to use the nomenclature of today, which I don't really like that much, that he preferred to go to those who were on the margins, to
Yeah.
those who were on the out
Yeah.
fringes
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
society. And I think in the mind of Christ, that's what he meant more than anything by the poor, those who suffered a sort of disenfranchisement, both economically and in
The
many
dispossessed.
so socially dispossessed people.
Yeah.
Now, it's a very complex question that you raise, Gavin, and a good question, because we can't think anachronistically here in terms of wealth and what it is that Jesus is condemning. We have to remember that in his time, there were no social welfare programs from the Roman Empire for the poor. There was no social safety net. There was no national health system and these sorts of things. Therefore, the poor were largely beggars, and they depended
Yeah.
upon almsgiving, which is why I think it's very significant that at the end of Delixit, the Pope goes on an extended meditation on the retrieval of the ancient Christian concept of almsgiving. So, because when Christ is condemning the rich, I think what he is saying to them is, you have an obligation to give alms to the poor, because they
Yeah.
have no
Absolutely.
other
Absolutely.
way to survive. They have no other way to live than by the hand downs from those who are wealthy. And when he surveyed the landscape of his own time, and he saw the indifference of the wealthy towards almsgiving and so forth, I think he saw, yes, not just an economic largesse that they refused to share. I think he saw a spiritual poverty at its root, which is why he believed they could not go to heaven, because ultimately
Yeah.
that kind of clinging to a
Yes.
spirit of wealth acquisition is a spirit completely contrary to the spirit of God.
So
And
I think
therefore,
you've
I
summed
think
up
you
beautifully.
go
That's
ahead.
right.
No, go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
you've said let's use that language, because I think you've nailed it. What we're talking about is a spirit of acquisition, a spirit
Yes.
of emptiness. So what our Lord is doing is he's taking the temperature of the soul as it works its way out in an incarnational sense into the social circumstances, and he's saying, well, you're too full and too grabby to get into the kingdom of heaven, because you can only come into the kingdom if you have open hands. And actually, the poor are best at being open-handed, because what do they have? Nothing at all. The thing that I find hard to get my head around is the emergence of the state. Because in the last 200 years, the state has wrecked our notion of almsgiving. Because you were quite right. If it wasn't for the state, I would come out of my house and I would see beggars, people who didn't have as much as I would. And it would be absolutely morally incumbent upon me to give them food, to give them clothing, to give them the excess I had with. And by this means, I would not be clingy. I wouldn't have a spirit of possession. And I could make my way to heaven through that act of generosity. But the state's wrecked all that, because the state tells you, no, we've got this one. We've taken over from the church, in fact. We no longer lead the church to almsgiving, because we're going to do it for you. And what I don't find in the 20th and 21st century is any theological transition, anything that helps me transition to what is my responsibility towards my neighbor when the state says we've got this, and to some extent has got it. I mean, the
Yeah.
state does it. You have to be quite determined to stay on the streets without a roof over your head, or not to have, or not to eat and starve yourself to death. The state, it doesn't do it very well. It's corrupt, and I dislike the state immensely, but I don't. It's almost as if in this document, I feel anyway, having made out a great case for almsgiving, because right up until, I don't know, the turn of the 20th century, that was the test, or the main moral directive. But since then, is it? What do I do about my responsibility to the poor when the state says we've got this? And in one sense, I'm quite sympathetic with evangelicals, because evangelicals on a whole, I don't mean the prosperity gospel me. I mean, they say, well, we're not going to talk about economics because the state's got that. So we're just going to save souls. And I wonder if Catholic theology has caught up with where the evangelicals are, by recognizing that the whole almsgiving industry is to some extent, if not moribund, at least diminished, because
Oh
we
yeah.
face a competitor.
Well, it points to the social dimension too of almsgiving here. It's interesting that in Delixit the Pope also goes on an extended meditation on the history of monastic giving to the
Yeah,
poor, and that the monasteries institutionalized. They invented hospitals. They invented sort of schools for the poor.
absolutely.
They became a safe haven for the poor, and so on. And you would know this because you're British. One of the unintended consequences of King Henry's demolition of the monastic system in the UK was that the social welfare function, the almsgiving function of those monasteries disappeared
Yep.
as the monarchy confiscated the wealth, which then led to extreme social dislocation in
Yeah.
England and an increase in poverty. Then it took a while for the British government to come around and say, okay, we need poorhouses, we need social welfare systems and so forth. But they probably wouldn't have needed any of those things had they simply left the social matrix, the social nexus of Christian charity in the monastic system intact. Now, that points
Absolutely.
to a barrier that we have. And I wish if there was a shortcoming in Delexite, one of them, there are actually many, but that the Pope doesn't explicitly link those monastic traditions then with almsgiving, because the problem with our almsgiving today is it's so privatized,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
doesn't have this social context. Whereas if I'm a member of a religious organization, say the Catholic Church, and it has numerous institutions within its ranks that serve the poor in a very direct way, then I know where my almsgiving can go that's going to make this big, huge difference. Now, the problem, though, is that even the Catholic Church today has bureaucratized its charity, okay? And that so many of the religious orders that were hands-on in the streets, like Mother Teresa dragging the poor off the streets, so many of our, well, we're going to start a hospital and we're going to take federal money and we're going to act like
Right.
secular hospitals but with crosses on the walls, and oh, you go to Catholic Charities and I'm poor, but okay, fill out these forms and we can send you to one of our counselors. And I mean, it's like almost a mirror image of the secular. So what is lacking in Delexete, I think, is a deeper analysis of the social character of Christian charity down through the centuries. Now, the Pope does go through this huge, long list, and it's beautiful, of all the ways in which the Catholic
Mm.
Church down through the centuries has aided the poor. Whole religious orders devoted to care for the poor, care for the sick, care for the marginalized in so many ways. But he doesn't connect the dots. He doesn't say, and we need to retrieve that social matrix in a personalist way that's non-bureaucratized, that is transformative, that people put a face on it. They feel like it makes a difference. One of the reasons when we walk down the street and we see, a homeless person on the street lying there in squalor, we don't give them that $1 or $5 is, well, they might be going to buy drugs with it. They might be going to buy booze with it. But if and so as a private individual, you're saying, no, I'm not going to. I ran into that when I got my PhD at Fordham in New York City. I was walking past homeless people all the time. Whereas I lived in the Dominican Republic for a while, and the poor were different. And I
Yeah.
would stuff my pockets with cheese crackers and things like that. And
Yeah.
little kids, clearly impoverished kids would walk up and I'd hand them pieces of food, candy, crackers. And they were very, very grateful for that instead of money. And so Pope Leo mentions it, but once again, he doesn't connect the dots, that there are different kinds of poverty. One of the things, in terms of even economic poverty, one of the things I mentioned in my article was, and I wish he had mentioned it, in affluent countries, homelessness and extreme poverty are almost uniformly created by drug addiction and mental illness.
Right.
All right.
Absolutely.
And that goes completely unaddressed in this document. And
And
yet it
and
is
and as you quite
essential.
rightly Absolutely, and as you quite rightly say, it gets in the way of our almsgiving because there are some of us who go down the road and say, "I'm going to give this man money, even if he spends it on drugs, because I need to give it to him, and I'd like an opportunity to dignify him with a conversation. Hi, how are you doing? I'm sorry you're like this. Look, here's something." And in my understanding, the dignifying of him as a fellow human being that you want to spend time with is as important as whatever you're giving him. But it's still problematic. We don't know whether it's the right moral thing to do. And I'd like to take what you very helpfully discussed there and just take it one step further. In terms of Catholic giving, it feels to me like we're invited to pay a tax, a charitable tax for the sake of our consciences to an organization which then takes care of it for us. Yeah. Instead of almsgiving, which is me giving it to him, which, as you quite rightly said, is the equivalent of stuffing your pocket with crackers and other things, because that's what they need. And so I'm still not clear on the if you like, the moral duty of almsgiving in a situation where we have these two things we've helpfully delineated. Me by saying, A, there's a state, and you by saying, and there's drugs. And the reason I found, I think I may have overreacted, but the reason I did overreact was that as the state has made its appearance in my mind and confused my sense of moral priority, what I then saw is the South American concern for justice raise its head. And you're right, he doesn't talk about liberation theology, but the trouble is I've had a bad experience with the liberation theologians. There was a period of 5 years or so where I got really excited about it. When I first became a Christian in 1975, I really badly wanted to be a Christian Marxist because at the age of 21, I wanted to be cool. And Christianity wasn't cool, but Marxists were cool. I had the long hair of a Che Guevara. I was desperate to be able to be a Christian Marxist. And so when liberation theology came along, I thought, well, this is it. This is how I get to be a Christian Marxist. And I was very excited by it. And then I discovered that doesn't work. So I'm a bit. I carry with me the emotional wounds of a jilted lover when it comes to liberation theology. I wanted it so badly to be true and discovered it wasn't. And so, when the image of the jilted lover pops up on the screen, I go, oh no, I'm scolded. Keep away. And so I think that's partly why. So tell me, I am overreacting, or I don't need to.
No, I don't think you're completely overreacting at all. The fact is, I had a similar path. When I was at Fordham, I took courses in liberation theology, and I too was, because I had lived in Latin America, I was very, very interested in any theology that would wed the church's central Christological Trinitarian dogmas to a powerful interest in aiding and abetting those who are less fortunate. And I was going to write my doctoral dissertation on liberation theology for that reason. But the more I dug down into it, the more I realized that it was untenable, that it was a metaphysical, theological flatlining of the Christian message into a horizontalist goo.
Oh, nice phrase.
It was
phrase.
Inextricably tied up with bad Marxist social analysis of class warfare and so forth. And so it needed to be called out. Now, one interesting thing about Delixit is that Pope Francis, though he doesn't mention liberation theology, he quotes Ratzinger's document that he wrote on liberation theology while at the CDF. And Leo even notes, he says, a document that was not well received when it first came out, or some words to that effect. And he quoted it anyway. Now, I saw that as a great step forward. I don't think Pope Francis would have quoted that. Let's just put it that way. I might be wrong, but I don't think he would have quoted it. But you're right. No less a light than, one of the great, most famous, noteworthy liberation theologians was the Brazilian Leonardo Boff. And yet Leonardo Boff's own brother, I think Clovis is his name, has just recently come out with a new book, very, very critical of liberation theology, on the grounds that it was overly horizontalist. Mm-hmm. And his analysis takes into account the fact that now in Latin America, the Catholic Church is hemorrhaging believers to Pentecostal groups. And he says, why is that so? And it's because despite their lack of any sort of social justice awareness, they preach Christ and him crucified, and an experience. and an
Yeah,
immediate experience of the supernatural. People were
yeah,
seeking the vertical. He says, we had
absolutely.
just emphasized bread and people were looking for heaven. All
Yeah.
right. We were giving them stones really instead of bread, is what he says. And I think that's the message that I began to realize as well, which is why I ended up doing my dissertation on Hans Urs von Balthasar.
Can I
Uh,
just can I just stop in a moment? Don't let me not do not let me stop you telling us about your dissertation, because that
no,
might
no,
be
I just mentioned it that it was like a night and day turn. That's all. Go ahead.
see, one of the dots I'm trying to join is my sense of arton epusion. I've forgotten when it was, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, when I first was reading the Lord's Prayer in Greek again. I went, wait a minute, what is arton epusion? Are you serious? The bread concerning my ultimate being. This isn't lunch. this
No.
is this is the Blessed Sacrament. And then I discovered that Jerome had translated it, once properly and once improperly, but the improper translation is what got in. And so we're stuck with daily bread when really it's the bread of supernatural life. And as you quite rightly say, in South America, the supernatural life is being presented, and Catholicism, which ought to be the most supernatural of all Christianities, has sold out to the horizontal. In fact, when I became a Christian in 75, I said, Lord, I'd like either to be a Pentecostal or a Catholic, please, because they do supernatural properly. And it's taken me a while to get here, but I'm a bit fed up that having got here, the Pentecostals are still doing the supernatural, and I'm having to persuade the
Well,
Catholics to come back to it.
and what's interesting about this is it relates once again to your insights about being poor in spirit, because actual physical poverty, not having the means of feeding and clothing yourself and so forth, doesn't normally lead one into a horizontalist worldview. It actually leads one more into a quest for the supernatural. You
Oh,
know,
now explain this. This is good
well,
stuff. Expand.
it does, because the government isn't going to help you. Your economic surroundings aren't there to help you. The rich and the powerful and the elites of your society couldn't care less about you.
Yeah.
Who does care about you? God.
Jesus.
God cares
Yes.
about me.
Absolutely.
Jesus cares about me.
Yeah.
And so what arises in places like Africa and Latin America, amongst the poor in particular, growing out of the remnants of a strong animist form of religiosity that remained strong in both those continents. All right. uh, to such an extent that as an outsider, when I was in Latin America, it all appeared so syncretistic to me. All right, because right next to a statue of the Sacred Heart of Jesus will be a bunch of voodoo symbols or Santeria or other sorts of pagan symbols, that they created this amalgam. But what it was a kind of folk religion seeking access to the supernatural,
Yeah.
uh, and they found that as well in the Catholic Church for many, many centuries. Why was Our Lady of Guadalupe so powerful as a tool of
Mm. Mm.
evangelizing? It gave people this sense of an immediacy of the supernatural. But then the church has this revolution beginning in the 70s, where all of a sudden it's just talking about economic things.
Mm.
And people turn to, okay, that's all well and good, but my condition really isn't improving economically despite all your kind words. uh you know, and what I
Yeah.
want is God. What I want is the church to give me God access, unbrokered access to God through the sacraments in a way
I
that's deeply supernatural.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I'm cross with the liberation. Well, I'm cross with church theologians, because if we take up the theme you've helpfully explained, that we've got stuck into the horizontal, it seemed to me that this kind of Marxist theology was being done by middle class church theologians who were guilty about their middle classness, and somehow wanted to express their guilt by provoking a form of social revolution, so that
Well,
paradoxically,
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to steel
go ahead.
man your argument by pointing out they weren't just guilty, feeling guilty about their middle class bourgeois status. Many of the religious orders and priests and so forth were feeling guilty about the fact that the Catholic Church in Latin America had routinely sided with the rich, the powerful. That
Yeah.
they had followed a missionary pathway that many missions followed, which is you don't go directly to the poor. Instead, you educate the sons and daughters of the rich. You educate educate the sons and daughters of the political classes. And then once you educate society's elites and you are in the corridors of power, hopefully then things will trickle down to the poor. So there was what emerged in Latin America was a great collusion between the church and the forces of wealth and political power. And I think many church leaders overreacted to that and said, well, we just need to divest ourselves of all of that nonsense.
Exactly. And what they failed to do was to pick up Jesus' not preferential option for the poor, which is what they did do. They failed to pick up his aversion for the rich. There's no reason why you shouldn't get in amongst the rich and to use them. After all, it is influence. And that's what they did with the Anglo-Saxons here. But having got in amongst them and persuaded them to become Christian, you then pursue Jesus' aversion to the rich in order to wean them off the things of the world and make them rich in spirit instead of rich in power and economics. And that's why I think I object to the preferential option for the poor, because although it's not untrue, it misses the whole point. The problem is not the poor, the problem is the rich. And they're the ones who have to be evangelized and to be helped to get into the kingdom of heaven. Because I suspect, well, Jesus' parable about Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man, the poor man lying at the gates, gets into heaven because heaven is just. And it says, you had a terrible time, we'll make it up to you. And the rich man doesn't get in because rich people can't get into heaven. And that's why we have to have different strategies for the rich and the poor. And one is to tell the rich that there is an aversion to them in heaven because they won't open their hearts. And if they won't open their hearts, they can't get saved and then they can't get to heaven. So it strikes me that we need to have a balanced theology of how we deal with the poor and rich, and it's not symmetrical.
No, and unfortunately, what so often happens in the Western Church, and I wish the Pope had delved more deeply into this, is there is this all too quick equating of working for the poor with supporting left-wing political causes.
Right.
Because the left cares about the poor. The left enacts social legislation for the poor. The left does all these things. The right is just nothing but laissez-faire marketplace economics, to hell with the poor. That is a bad caricature because in many, many ways, as we now know, in the United States, the left has morphed away from a political movement concerned with the immigrant, the working classes, labor unions, anti-war, those sorts of things. It morphed into the party of transgendered surgery for 9-year-olds and abortions galore for everyone. It became the party of the sexual revolution and so on. And this gets neglected. And the fact of the matter is that the poor suffer under such regimes. They might get handouts that they wouldn't get from more right-wing governments, but maybe not having the handouts might be a good thing in some ways. So I don't know. I'm not an economist. I'm not a politician, and I don't want to wade too deep into waters in which I'm not an expert. But it does seem to me that there is this insouciance about, well, the left supports the poor and the right doesn't. And I think that that's absurd.
It's too simple, isn't it? But apart from anything else, both, I mean, my if you like, my anecdotal heroes of the last few years have been Jordan Peterson and Benedict. It's not that I'm not critical of Peterson. I could find a dozen things to be critical with him over, but he's one of the very few people who had the courage to say that the collectivism of the left is destroying what Christianity gives, which is a sense of responsibility. So he wasn't saying I am a Christian. He was simply saying, as a psychologist, I can see that collectivism disarms. It neutralizes all the things that human beings need to improve, which is a sense of personal responsibility. And part of the reason why we have a youth culture that's filled with ennui, with complete boredom, is because they see themselves as collectivist creatures belonging to a class or a subculture, rather than people who have to get up and make their beds and then find a way of making their way in the world, a world that will reward them for virtue and honesty in the way that the state and collectivism won't. So, but it seemed to me that, leaving aside the left and the right, the two voices of Christian sanity were paradoxically Peterson and then our beloved Benedict. I just loved what he said about the fact that capitalism needed Christianizing. It it needed relations of trust, for example, relations of charity, and the idea that you can either have collectivism or capitalism, and Christians have to choose between them, is so unhelpful. What we need to do is evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of both, and be allowed to do that without being forced to be cool and on the left or hard-hearted and on the
Yeah.
right.
I couldn't agree more about Pope Benedict. Just a tremendous mind and a force for good. I know very little, actually, about Jordan Peterson. As a side note, in my last interview with you, which I posted on Facebook, there was one fellow who, you may have read it. He made comments down below about, why are you interviewing Gavin Ashenden when he's a friend of far right wing thinkers like Jordan Peterson? But I didn't really know what to say, because I don't really know that much about Peterson, other than the fact that I do kind of admire his chutzpah. And so I want readers, listeners.
He's a psychologist. He's a very well informed psychologist who,
I understand that go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, in an extraordinary way, he was able to see just one step backwards. The Gospels are the Gospels because they're true in so many ways. Almost any discipline you like to evaluate them with, they will sparkle, refresh, and revivify. And as a psychologist, he went to the Gospels and he said, "Oh my goodness, this is all psychologically true. So I'm going to forget the supernatural and the dogma. I'm just going to talk about myth and archetype and structure. This is good stuff. I wish we psychologists had raw material like this in our textbooks, because this stuff works to make people better." Now, because he wasn't on the left, he got called far right. But the problem is that we live in a world, I think, where, and this is another Peterson insight, people don't have ideas, ideas have them, where many of our critics are possessed by ideas that stop them hearing what we're saying, because this big bad idea so bumbles around in their head that they can't find other pieces of information, and they're stuck with this one idea. Now, one of the greatest difficulties that I have, I don't know how you found it, is that I'm talking with people who are so ideologically committed that then they're just not able to hear different languages of metaphysics or philosophy.
Oh gosh, I couldn't agree more. In fact, the fellow who made the Facebook post critical of you for supporting Jordan Peterson because Peterson is far right, that is exactly the thought that came to my mind, Gavin, was that I know enough about Jordan Peterson to know he might be many things, and I am critical of him on some things as well, but he's not far right, And so the critic is possessed of this idea, this big idea that Jordan Peterson doesn't buy into, and therefore, well, he's far right. He's extreme far right, And so,
can I just say, because I'd like this to be out there for people to know, again, this silly idea people get possessed with is of the right and left and the far right. But I was invited, and I'm sorry if this sounds pretentious, but it makes an important point beyond my pretentiousness. I was invited to a private seminar in Cambridge between Jordan Peterson and Ian McGilchrist, the guy who wrote The Divided.
Oh yeah.
So the man
who master and its emissary, the master and its emissary.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. So the man who organized this, who was a Christian professor of theology at Cambridge, wanted to put McGilchrist and Peterson under the Christian cosh. So he invited 12 academics, half of whom were secular, like they were, or said they were, and half of them were Christian. And one of the jobs we Christians had to do was to say to these people, McGilchrist and Peterson, look, you're actually, a la Tom Holland, you're borrowing from all our treasury of ideas and values, but you're stopping short of implementing them, because to do this, you have to give yourself to Christianity. So if you like, you're parasitical upon the treasure we've provided you with, and you've both written but you need to be Christian to make this thing work. So that, half the academics who weren't Christian said, well, we're a bit worried you're becoming too Christian. And the rest of us said, no, you will not, you won't find salvation for yourself, and you won't find salvation for your readers unless you come off the fence and become Christian. Now, I'm no far right supporter of Jordan Peterson. I was put next to him at lunch to try and convert him, and I failed completely because the two women on the right flirted with him, and he was much more, quite rightly, taken with them with the conversation there. I mean, I tried to discuss Auschwitz and the problem of evil, to move him from his Jungian archetypal fascination into metaphysics. I failed completely, but always to imagine that any conversation has to be one between the cool left and the far right is just such a, it's like talking only ever of gay rights and imagining that human complexity can be reduced either to the partisanship of the political spectrum, or or to who do you want to sleep with. It's just so shallow.
And the people on the left who speak the most about dialogue and inclusion don't really mean it. I mean, they're the
Not
first.
at all.
They're the first to chuck both of those concepts out the window
Yeah.
when you're talking about anybody. Oh, you shouldn't talk to Jordan Peterson. He's a horrible human being. He doesn't believe that we should cut off the genitalia of 10-year-old boys if they're gender confused. So that makes him a horrible bigot. Like, oh, okay.
And it's guilt by association, which is from which you can never ever recover. And if we allow guilt by association, not that we can easily stop it, we have to resist it. But if we allow guilt by association, we never get the conversations we need, because there are people we have to talk to that, even if the left socially disapprove, we have to talk to them. Apart from anything else, only talking to them will change their mind.
Yeah, and to return then to Delixit I'm going to link the two, and this need for dialogue with people and the other. This is how I'm approaching this new papal document. It is a document that I'm going to sit back, I'm going to give the Holy Father the benefit of the doubt, and I'm going to attempt to dialogue with it, even though there are parts of it I don't like. Parts of it that I think should have been written differently. I'm going to sit back and I'm going to say, I'm going to not let my big idea impose itself on this document. I'm trying to let this document speak to me. Now, in that regard, I was left a little bit, despite the beauty of the document, its Christological meditation is beautiful.
Yes.
Although I think I think it goes overboard a bit in its description of Christ being actually economically poor, that his family was economically poor. I think that's a dubious assertion. Yeah, I think that's a dubious assertion. I think he's stretching there. But in by and large, I was left unfazed by the document, because I was more struck by what it didn't say than by what it did say, by what it left out rather than what it put in. So things like an analysis of the causes of poverty, since that's what we're talking about here, rather than breezy generalizations about our need to aid the poor. Well, give us some real meat, substance with regard to what are the causes of poverty in our time, to go into a drug addiction and mental illness and so forth. He says, there are problems with free market economics and the inequalities it creates. There are some problems with regard to not greeting the immigrant, and as I say in my article, well, who could disagree in some sense with it? There were robber baron capitalists, and there still are robber baron capitalists today in their own way. So there is a critique that needs to be brought to bear on certain kinds of free marketry. And there are some forms of nativist, bigoted, xenophobic, anti-immigration people, but that doesn't belie the fact that people have a right to be a little concerned that their country's being overrun by people from another culture and another place that has brought disease and crime and so forth. In other words, there's no acknowledgement in the text that people have a right, that they're right to have these concerns, that these are not just rank forms of greed and bigotry and prejudice, that they are rooted in deep social realities that have vexed ordinary people and brought them to the point of saying, what's going on here? All right.
I don't want this to become a mutual fan club, but I mean, again, thank you so much for saying that. It's the missing adjective that upsets me. I mean, I've been engaging in my mind with the discovery that anti-Semitism is alive and well in traditional Catholicism, and one of the ways it expresses itself is the phrase "the Jews." Without it, I wouldn't mind if you put in an adjective, and let me not go down that particular rabbit hole, but go to you in immigration. I don't mind you talking about immigrants, but please give me an adjective: the legal immigrants, the illegal immigrants, the raping immigrants, the abusive immigrants, the needy, worthwhile. Which immigrants are you talking about? Because they come in all kinds of shapes and moral sizes. And a number of people have criticized Pope Leo for saying, but this is really problematically simplistic. You cannot talk about the immigrants. It's a kind of, again, it's a form of vacant collectivism that doesn't work. We need to be able to discern, discriminate, discrezia between one kind of immigrant and another. Maybe you're talking about an immigrant I need to be compassionate to, but my fear is you're talking about an immigrant I need to resist.
Yeah, along those lines, that is entirely true, and that's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not opposed to anything the Pope says in the document, but I'm concerned by what it doesn't say, and it doesn't
Yeah.
make those kinds of important
The lack of
distinctions
adjectives. Yeah.
that have
Yeah.
to be made. I mean, as an American, I'm well aware. I am a fifth generation son of immigrants from Poland and Italy. I remember that the United States once welcomed through Ellis Island millions and millions and millions of Irish and Italian immigrants, for example. And yet we need to remember that in letting in those millions, it was legal. It was but it was easy. In other words, it was a very expansive, very capacious allowance for immigration, but there was still a checkpoint. You still had to show papers. You still had to show, no, I don't have tuberculosis, right? And you were allowed in. And certainly today, we have even greater techniques for weeding out the criminal element and so forth. But what I like to remind Americans in particular is, yeah, we accepted in those millions of immigrants. And you brought up the issue of crime. The Italian immigrants in particular created the greatest crime syndicate in the history of the world when they were here, and the Irish were not far behind. Okay,
Absolutely.
so we can't have historic, but rather than using that then as a reason why, well, okay, we shouldn't be concerned about the criminal element amongst immigrants. No, what it shows us is that the immigrants are not just an abstraction, some great essentialized thing that we simply have to accept. That the reality of immigration historically, then and now, is that there is a criminal element that comes in.
Yeah.
And that criminal element, if you don't deal with it, is going to create real problems for your culture and your society. It certainly did. I mean, whole urban centers in the United States were controlled by mafia money, okay, and corrupt to their core. And that can happen here too, again, if we're not careful. So this is not xenophobia, and I just wish that the document had spent a little bit more time valorizing the concerns of people. I mean, once again, you are often criticized by your critics. Oh, Gavin Ashenden, he's a bigot, he's xenophobic, he's anti-immigrant, and so forth. I've never heard that from you. And I'm very pro-immigration, pro-legal immigration. I believe in immigration. And I like those parts of Delixit where the Pope reminds us of the need to pay attention to the migrant and their needs. But by the same token, once again, we can't get this big idea in our head that says, well, if you want to throw up certain roadblocks, that means you're a far-right hater of the immigrant. And those are distinctions that have to be made, right, Gavin? Don't you think?
Completely. I mean, for example, what people don't know is that I'm trying to emigrate to Europe. I'm desperate to get into France. I'm an immigrant who knocks on the doors of France and saying, take me in. I have a house here. I pay taxes here. I'd like to come in. And they, in their far right fascist bigotry, say, no, you're not coming in because you've come by a legal route we disapprove of. I wish there was some kind of way I could get into a dinghy and simply go across to France and then access my house. To some extent, I'm making fun of the system, but of course I'm not anti-immigrant. I mean, what Christian would be anti-immigrant? Because we don't see immigrants, we see people in the image of God. And then we do what we're asked to do, which is to ask questions about the way in which the image of God can be deepened in them as it's being deepened in me. We are theological before we're ever political. And again, there's this problem of our critics having a single idea in their head by which they look at the whole the rest of the world and then demonize us for so-called demonizing
Yeah.
other people. Well, actually, we're not demonizing anybody, because to have a theological and a Christological worldview is the opposite of demonization. It's getting rid of the demons
Yeah.
in order to bring in the saints and the angels. It is unfair. But then on the other hand, that's we don't expect things to be
I
fair.
would say this though too on this issue of immigration, and I'll be slightly critical of my brothers and sisters in the UK, in Europe, and to a certain extent in the United States, which is, yes, there is a populist sentiment gaining steam, places like France and Germany and Denmark, the UK, Ireland, against, open immigration, that people feel inundated and so forth. Okay, and we can talk about what the legal and political ramifications of all that is, what policies we should adopt. But I also would say this. I think part of the angst that people have is precisely because they are aware of how deeply, deeply, deeply secular Europe has become. And that secularism does not provide us with the glue for holding these various disparate ethnic groups together, that they sense a certain cultural cacophony creeping in. So, what I would say to my European friends, go to church, start having babies again.
Yeah.
But, part of the problem is secularization. One of the Muslims have babies. Christians don't anymore. Muslims go to mosque. Christians don't anymore.
Okay,
So the
but
best cultural way to fight back is to go to church and have families.
absolutely. And if you want to know if Ashenden is a bigot, he simply has a preferential system. I very much like Polish immigrants in this country because
Yes, I'm half Polish, so there you go.
well, because they brought in with them skills and moral virtues that woke us up, and there was a kind of infusion of Poles in particular in the late 80s and the 90s, to the extent where Poland said, "Give them back. We need our young men and women." But you wouldn't have heard a word from me against the Poles who came in. I just liked them. I liked them. I liked what they stood for. It wasn't about immigration that my hackles were. On the other hand, I don't like Islam. I like Muslims. I don't like Islam. I've just been listening to a lecture from a major historian saying that we have a huge Islamic problem in the Home Office, and one of the things is they expect bribes, because Islam has a culture where close societies based on family allegiances pay money to each other to get things done. Now, that's not a Christian virtue. It might be an Islamic cultural one, but it's a problem for me if my culture is taken over by one that bribes people, because I'd rather be in a culture that didn't bribe people. That's not racist and bigotry. That's
Right,
simply saying
right.
we're allowed to have different values, and these are the ones I want. But I shouldn't be defending myself against bigotry, because first of all, I'm not going to persuade anybody, and secondly, there's no need. Can I ask you a bigger question? Pope Leo, because people are going to start losing their attention span for us both, even though I'm enormously refreshed and stimulated by the way the conversation's gone, and thank you so much for it. I'm trying to understand Pope Leo, and I've settled on the notion of compartmentalization. I think he has a liberal and a Democrat head and a Catholic heart, and the reason I think that is because I hear him saying things about church teaching, wearing Catholic clothes, using Latin, the language, if you like, of a Catholic heart, whereas I hear him thinking and saying democratic progressive things like immigration is as important as abortion, and you can give an abortionist senator an award because he's done 30 years 40 years public service, things that are views that belong really on the democratic left.
Yeah.
Now, is there a better way of understanding Robert Prevost than somebody who's
Well,
compartmentalized
yeah,
in this way?
I think you could be right. I think the verdict is still out on that. As to it's not a bad analysis at all, because it's a rather common phenomenon these days. But I'll say this with regard to his off the cuff comments to the reporter about Senator Durbin and the award that Cardinal Supich wanted to give him. I think that Pope Leo was caught a little off guard, and I don't think he gave the best response at all. And I think he himself realized that, because just the other day,
Yeah,
in
I
other words,
saw that. Yeah.
somebody asked him a question about Trump and immigration. He says, I'm not going to comment on the doings of American politics. Ah,
Oh, I
he
went,
learned.
hallelujah. He
He
learned.
learned
No,
his lesson.
one lesson. The quick whack as quick.
So I think that what one way of adjudicating Pope Leo at this point, and he himself said so in the Crux interview with Elise Allen. I don't know if you saw it, but it's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, absolutely.
He's
Yes.
learning on the job. He
Yeah.
doesn't yet quite know how to be Pope. And I
Mm.
think one of the reasons why he has played his cards so close to the vest so far, and he really hasn't done anything earth shaking, or the right or left, one way or the other, is I think he is right now feeling a little bit on a learning curve. You might say overwhelmed, but that would be to crawl into his head and sense his psychological state. But I definitely think, as per his own admission, he's on a learning curve here. And I hope he learned his lesson with regard to the backlash that he got with regard to that comment about Senator Durbin, because what he was appealing to was the classic Cardinal Bernardine seamless garment of
Yeah.
life ethic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
here's the problem with that. By that same ethic, Senator Durbin falls short and should not be given an award. Just as you wouldn't give
Yes.
an award to an anti-abortion Catholic activist who was really awful on just about every other issue, because they violated the seamless garment of life. Why would you give an award to Senator Durbin because he was good on this one issue, which I didn't even think he was good on that, when he fell short on all the others? So if you're going to invoke
Yeah.
the seamless garment of life as a justification for giving Durbin an award, I think you're on very thin ice there. And I think the Pope realized that, which is why I think in the next off the cuff encounter, he says, no comment. I'm not putting my foot in that cow pie again. All right.
That's
So,
very helpful.
but once again, to go
Larry,
back,
go on.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No,
No,
you
I
go.
want you to,
You go.
I was going to say
No, no.
that I want to go back to, my concern with the document isn't with what it says, but what it doesn't say. And once again,
No.
all the beautiful bits that are in, and I do encourage people to read it because I think overall it's a very beautiful document. But I think because it reminds us of our obligation to the poor. But as I said, he doesn't connect certain dots. There's no deep analysis in the document. And what I said not too long ago about secularization, tie that into what I said before about the loss of the social matrix of charity because we've lost the monastic safety net and so forth. I think this is extremely, extremely important. That if you're trying to assess the signs of the times, pastorally speaking, if you're trying to figure out the best response of the church to the modern world, you need to first begin with the truth of our situation. And the truth of the situation is that the bottom has fallen out in Western societies of Catholic culture. There is no longer really a strong Catholic subculture. We're still short of priests and nuns. Religious orders are dying. Classic Christian Catholic institutions like hospitals and schools are secularizing, are going out of business. Parishes are closing. Parishes are consolidating. We are on a downward trend. And the bottom has fallen out of this. So you can talk about the poor, you can talk about almsgiving, but in the very concept of the social structures of sin that he invokes, as did John Paul, you would need then to invoke an analysis of our social structures that points out the absolute necessity of Catholic social structures, a
Absolutely.
Catholic culture. And that requires a strong Catholic identity, which is precisely my big problem with Pope Francis, is that he did everything in his power to disenfranchise and alienate those people most devoted to building that Catholic culture.
Yes, including his clergy. I mean,
Yes.
yes, absolutely. Larry, let this be the note we end on, because that's a tremendous climax. And we might then. I'm sure the Vatican don't listen to podcasts from, but if they did, they might say to the Pope, "Look, actually, Professor Larry Chapp has just given you your strategy for your papacy. Restore the courage to Catholics to be Catholic.
Yes.
Renew the confidence of the Catholic Church, upon which all the best bits of our civilization were built. Because if you can do that, then you will have been Peter's worthy successor and a shepherd for the sheep in the church. Larry, I think you've nailed it, and thank you for being so articulate. It's
Oh,
just
well,
a great way to end.
I'm flattered, but thank you for having me, Gavin. Great conversation.
No,
Thank
no,
you.
no. It's been so nice to be able to talk about it, and also, you've helped me. You've helped me be slightly less averse to my jilted lover at the end of liberation theology,
Well,
and for which I'm
yeah,
very
I don't
grateful.
think at this point there's any right or wrong analysis. We're all sort of still groping in the dark here.
Well, I like yours. Thank you very much for sharing it. It's been
Thank you,
really
Gavin.
great to have you. God bless you and thank you.
Thank you.